Ozarks. We are discussing the connection between witchcraft and the Ozarks. You hear about witchcraft in old Europe, New Orleans, even Salem, Massachusetts. But how much conjuring and magic is there in the Ozarks?
The hills and hollows and plateaus hide lots of things, and practicing witches have always been here, from Native American black magic to slaves keeping conjure ways alive, to European settlers quietly passing the old ways from generation to generation. Witchcraft has never been far. So much so, this is part 2 of the discussion.
We will get back to witchcraft, but first we want to invite you to like, follow, and subscribe to Dark Ozarks on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, as well as your favorite podcast platform. We also invite you to become a Dark Ozarks subscriber on Facebook. On the Dark Ozarks Facebook page, click subscribe, have your login information ready, and join Dark Ozarks behind the scenes for only $4.99 per month.
Your $4.99 per month subscription allows you to come with us on paranormal investigations, deep dive research, and topics too controversial for public view. The next 100 subscribers will be entered in a drawing for a free Dark Ozarks t-shirt and an exclusive signed first-run copy of the book, Dark Ozarks, The Spooklight. Subscribe today to be entered in the drawing.
And now you can get Dark Ozarks t-shirts for sale at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com.
Mark your calendars for upcoming live events beginning Saturday, September 30th at the Civil War home Kendrick House in Carthage, Missouri, and a number of other locations through November. Meet Dark Ozarks producers Lisa and Josh for evenings of history, legends, and the paranormal, and even visit some of the most haunted locations in the Ozarks. Details on the Dark Ozarks Facebook page. Visit www.paranormalsciencelab.com for tickets and more information.
We encourage you to check out Always Buying Books in Joplin, Missouri, in person and online, on Facebook and at the website alwaysbuyingbooks.com for all your reading needs, including a large section on the paranormal, history, and more. Not to mention, the building is haunted. Tell Bob and Elise we sent you.
We also want to thank Beard Engine Brewing Company in Alba, Missouri. Beard Engine Brewing is the only English-style brewery in Missouri and has been twice named Missouri's best brewery by the Missouri Brewers Association. Great beer and great food in a historical building with a noir past. And yes, their building is also haunted. Tell Nate and Tiff that we sent you.
Witchcraft in the Ozarks.
Part 2, but I think it's well worth jumping in where we were on the YouTube short, which is the realities and the traditions of witchcraft are, first of all, very complex because every people group that settled in the Ozarks brought a form of witchcraft with them. But what makes some of this analysis difficult is that in many cases, the witchcraft is brought along, but not spoken of.
That's true. And then, even though it's not spoken of openly, the different traditions influenced each other. And in some situations, just incorporated aspects of the other tradition, but the original belief stayed the same. And in others, something brand new ultimately happened.
It did. And certainly the most obvious, just in terms of Americanism or American development of practical witchcraft. And that is, I do want to note that while there are certainly some suggestions, some inferences of traditional high magic taking place in the Ozarks, the vast bulk of quote unquote witchcraft that is documented or is understood to take place in the Ozarks is conjure practice and folk magic. It's very practical. It is not hypothetical or high magic.
Exactly. And aspects of this follow through and affect beliefs in the supernatural and ghosts and the paranormal as well that we'll
It
get
does.
to.
It does. It's honestly, so many aspects of this is very hard to parse out one from the other because they do interrelate. They do impact belief structures, ideas, ways of seeing things. That really, I think the word that we're looking for is cosmology, and that cosmology from various people groups has some strong crossover, and it could be conjectured that certain settlement groups in North America, as well as indigenous peoples in North America, may have found points of commonality via witchcraft.
I think that is a very fair statement and borne out by anthropology, by archaeology, and really even just current observances.
And it can be interesting. It can be difficult to parse out, some because of religious reasons.
True. And other just societal reasons over time that pressures to keep practices, under the table, and to deny the existence. So, and that has led at various times with sort of particularly the academic element, to say, oh, beliefs in magic and beliefs in witchcraft are going away, are receding, that's all in the past, or things are not being practiced anymore. When oftentimes they just weren't being wholly open with the researchers.
Right. That, from an anthropological standpoint, I would posit this is definitely a point that Vance Randolph got right, even as he was bucking the trends of his contemporaries. And it's important to understand, especially for people who are not familiar with Randolph's work, that first, his documentation of Ozark culture from the 30s through the 1940s, particularly, was and is extraordinarily important.
Yes,
It's you really cannot overstate the importance of his documentation, and anyone who is interested in the Ozarks and Ozarks culture should absolutely get their hands on his books. Ozark Magic and Folklore being a staple, as well as a number of others. And Randolph, but what is often not understood in the dryness of the decontextualization today is that Randolph was a very controversial anthropologist, and in his day, and he was very controversial in the Ozarks, particularly amongst the Land of a Million Smiles contemporaries, the Booster Club folks, the Chambers of Commerce, the Country Club people, who were modernizing the Ozarks in the 1930s and 40s. And Vance Randolph came along and painted a picture very different than the one that was in their brochure.
Very much so, and one that they had hoped that they had buried in the past.
They wanted to bury that image, and all of this does clearly relate to witchcraft, but other aspects as well. You really cannot separate the understanding of the culture without the understanding of witchcraft, and vice versa.
True. Agreed.
It's surprisingly indelibly connected, and it within this process, within this attempt to modernize the Ozarks and create this modern haven of tourism, which they were. I'm grateful they were only partially successful, but there was this push that, and it was, I think, admittedly, a very secular push, a push to say that the old cosmologies, the old folk beliefs that had resonated with the Scots-Irish, with the traditional German settlements that had strong ties to the German peasantry, the rural German peasantry and the mountain German peasantry of continental Europe, of course the African American impacts of former enslaved peoples who carried with them the strong elements of the traditional West African animism cosmology that over time contributed to the development of hoodoo, and particularly in Haiti and Santo Domingo, and then was brought to New Orleans, and as well as other coastal areas, and then the development of hoodoo, and then of course the elements of Native American belief structures. That all of this was hokey, backwards, hillbilly stuff that it was very unsavory. It was considered to be inappropriate and unsavory. And Randolph published it for the entire world to see. And in many circles, he was a very, very unpopular figure during
kind of
that.
a pariah. He was a pariah in many ways.
And
to them.
It certainly is, understanding and contextualizing that reality today certainly brings a challenge to individuals interested in the Ozarks who are celebrating Vance Randolph or might celebrate Vance Randolph today without that contextualization, because many of those folks, you could put them back in that time and they'd be referring to him as a pariah as well.
Exactly. And it's, and it's interesting you made that connection with hoodoo in that regard. And there's a quote actually in our notes from Zora Hurston, who is sort of a preeminent writer of the 30s and 40s on hoodoo and voodoo in America, who faced pretty much the similar challenges that Randolph did with her career. But the statement, and it's on page 6 of our notes. Sometimes the dead are offended by acts of the living and slap the face of the living. When this happens, the head is slapped one-sided and the victim can never straighten his neck. Speak gently to ghosts and do not abuse the children of the dead. And I think it's kind of appropriate here because it just reminds us that the past has a way of not going away and coming out over time. That when things are never truly forgotten, they do tend to come out. And that's certainly the case with witchcraft practices, because they do get passed on, even if the majority of the people walking around don't recognize it.
They do. And in terms of coming out, so I think that it's very real that can come out in terms of mass social anxiety. It can come out in terms of the fear that we see when, say, for example, on an investigation, poltergeist activity manifests itself in a brand new suburban home where, quote unquote, nothing has gone on before other than maybe a Civil War skirmish or who knows what.
Yeah.
It's
just a few things.
We are not as disconnected from the past as we might think. And sometimes we are not nearly as disconnected from the past as we would like to be.
Very true. Very true. And it might be a good jumping off place to talk about some of these common folk practices that, folk medicine and items used by the common person. These are aspects that go under the radar more because they are of the common people. We always, it's a broad theme in history that we learn about the famous and the nobility, etc. But we don't learn near as much about the everyday people. And for the most part, witchcraft of all veins is of the common people.
It is. It is. And of course, I think perhaps one of the reasons that it resonates so much with me is that I find the history of the quote unquote common people to be vastly more interesting in many cases.
Me too.
And perhaps a good brief tangent on that. We often decry modern racism. We decry, the comparatively recent past. You go back 120 years or 100 years to the contemporaries of Vance, Randolph, etc. There is not just racism, but there is a vehement and I would say virulent classism against, first of all, against hillbillies.
Right, very much an elitist view.
And those views certainly inspired the distaste for Randolph's work, and reading and contextualizing the things that were being said. It is very fascinating because the things that are being said about poor Scots-Irish settlers and poor rural German settlers in the Ozarks and in Appalachia are extraordinarily similar, in some cases verbatim, of the extraordinarily negative racial slurs being leveled against non-white populations in the United States. It is a fascinating read, because it to me, it really infers a much darker side of the aristocracy, the comparative nouveau riche aristocracy in America of the Gilded Age and coming out of the Gilded Age. That there's an enormous amount of social tension, an enormous amount of upper elite distaste for common people, which of course we forget. 100 years after, 120 years after, without digging into those writings, it's very easy to forget. And we look at Norman Rockwell's paintings and various other artists and implying the turn of the century America, without realizing how much disdain was being potentially leveled at common people at various points.
Well, yeah, and a few episodes back, we when we were discussing haunted mansions, we discussed the rejection of the Gilded Age in the 1920s as basically rejecting what the prior generation had stood for. But part of that process as well was you had that going on, and then you had that backlash of that elitist view against the common man. And I think it is a circular pattern there, that then a lot of the everymen were rejecting the Gilded Age,
yes,
which led to the motifs of the Victorian haunted mansion. And so again, a lot of these different aspects of sociology and anthropology play into each other.
They do. They really do. And it is certainly something, I think, an aspect that I believe is positive over the past 30 or 40 years, has been a development of a deeper, much deeper or more open appreciation for the cosmologies of several of these groups. The obvious one that comes to mind is an association and a better understanding of hoodoo in some of its forms, and voodoo specifically, as relating back to the cosmology of West Africa.
Yes, I agree. I agree there. So over time, people like Randolph and Hurston are being vindicated.
Which makes me very, very happy.
Yeah.
And both are not just anthropological heroes of mine, but or cultural heroes of mine, but just as people, the writings that they were able to preserve and
Yes.
their voice that has continued to echo throughout the generations is extraordinarily wonderful. I highly Zora Neale Hurston is a hero of mine, as of
Mine
course
too.
is Randolph, and very, very phenomenal people who really had to buck a lot of trends during their day, and had to deal with the fact that they were doing um, dedicated, serious research that was rarely being recognized for its full value.
That's true, and kept at it and didn't give up.
No, and in terms of practical, so obviously the important distinction or basic delineation. You could define witchcraft into being either into quote unquote high magic or practical magic.
Mhm.
And how would you define high magic?
High magic to me typically is more ritualistic, is more form over function, so to speak, and tends to have a sort of a broad or sort of more grand social role of appearances to the communities, giving a common experience, and whether it's for building morale or persistence through hard times, those kinds of things, those sort of broad goals, typically. Practical magic is getting through today, getting through this week, making do without, getting things accomplished without the resources available to the well-to-do.
Yes. I think that's an excellent synopsis. And jumping back to conceptual Celtic roots or hypothetical Celtic roots for just a moment, the Order of the Golden Dawn definitely comes to mind in terms of
Yeah.
high magic, and W.B.
Yes.
Yeats was a huge proponent of the Order of the Golden Dawn. And there's a high circle
Mhm.
of luminary individuals, the most notorious and probably feared being Aleister Crowley, being
Mr.
involved.
Evil himself.
Yes, but there's a lot of other very interesting individuals, and I like balancing Crowley's work with W.B. Yeats, because in various forms they were involved in similar circles.
Well, socially, I mean, societally, yes, definitely, and really theoretically as well. I mean, in some ways, you could just kind of say one was the flip side of the other's coin.
And at the same time, by reading Yeats' work, eh, and just in terms of popular culture, you bring up W.B. Yeats, and nobody shudders. Nobody
Mhm.
is afraid. And certainly one of my favorite books is, well, several of his favorite books that he wrote. But Celtic Twilight is
Yeah.
really, really comes to mind. And his Celtic Twilight book, which interestingly enough, I purchased in Silver Dollar City in about 1999. They had a fantastic selection in their bookstore at the time. That really is clear. Yeats was fascinated by the unknown, but he was
Mhm.
definitely approaching it. To me, Yeats approached nearly everything with a lyrical and appropriately Celtic sense of magic.
Yeah.
It was very lilting. It was very Irish, and largely lighthearted. He ultimately defined evil as as a sense of being that is out of accordance with itself.
Yeah. Yeah. That pretty much sums up his writing.
And he didn't talk a lot about it. He
No.
talked some about ghosts. He talked a lot about fairies. He talked a lot about various societies. To me, Aleister Crowley strikes me as an individual who, if W.B. Yeats, brought a penny whistle to the fairy ring to ask for something, Aleister Crowley might have brought a sledgehammer.
Yeah, or at least a trumpet.
He was a bit dogmatic. And don't ask about the cats. But that sense of high magic is, to me, interesting because it does pay homage to practical magic, conjure, cunning folk. It does pay tribute to them, and there certainly is many of those traditions from the old world that ended up in the Ozarks, but it again is much more in the sense of high theory, high ritual, and something that it inadvertently, I feel, that's my disclaimer, that I feel there was a strong contribution to, is that high magic of the British Isles at the turn of the 20th century in terms of ritual and fraternal order, etc., contributed heavily to what we call the Celtic, the romanticized Celtic Golden Age that began crafting for sociopolitical reasons, which I largely agree with, as Ireland was striving to achieve its independence against Great Britain, creating a grand mythological past of that perhaps inadvertently borrowed as much from, they'd kill me for saying this, as much from old French Arthurian legend to craft the ideas, and inadvertently, or perhaps, I'll say inadvertently, obscured the actual greatness of the Celtic peoples.
Yes, well, and of course, go back far enough, some of the Celtic peoples were in France and contributed to those legends, but definitely there's that influence that if you're familiar with French literature, particularly medieval period, it has colored that rendition of the mythology in Ireland around the turn of the century. Yeah.
Far removed from a very Halloween Wicker Man holiday special.
It's not even October and you got there, huh?
I do love Wicker Man, and the original, not the extra crispy one with Nicolas Cage. But there is just a grounded sense of reality in practical magic, and particularly what we refer to as root work, that practice by root doctors, in Secret and Sacred, Contextualizing the Artifacts of African American Magic and Religion by Laura A. Wilkie, page 85, describes root doctors saying that they mainly specialized in the production and use of herbal and animal product pharmaceuticals to combat diseases that were perceived as being caused by natural agents of illness. Teas brewed from medicinal herbs or substances, Salves or whiskey-based homemade bitters were made and found in the medical kits of midwives, root doctors, and sometimes conjurers. Conjurers were more likely to use magical means to treat diseases that were perceived as being caused by supernatural agents, or to create magical means of control, be it in matters of love, hate, or luck, and used a combination of charms and spells to exert magical influence.
Yes, yes. And then some people might be surprised that traditionally midwives basically were also considered to be practicing magic.
Yes, yes. And that a really interesting crossover, of course, use of sympathetic magic through botanicals predominantly, but as well as animal parts.
Yes.
To put it bluntly, be they rattlesnake rattles, of course, the concept of lucky rabbit's foot as being one that entered into pop culture. And especially when you begin to tie the connection of the symbolism of the rabbit with cunning and understanding, the ability to escape, those types of things, the idea of the rabbit's foot starts to make more sense.
Well, yes, and I mean, all the way up to, to be perfectly honest, Bugs Bunny. I mean, Bugs Bunny is a perfect representation of that. He's the cunning one who's smarter than the ones around him, so it reverberates through time in one way or another.
It does. And of course, conjure and hoodoo, it should be said, are not religions.
No.
They are practices.
They are practices. Now, some of the practices might be used in conjunction with religious practices, particularly voodoo. But
Yes.
it's that they are two things that may or may not converge in time and place.
And certainly an aspect that could be very confusing to the less astute anthropologist, particularly one who has not had the dignity to go native. And that's coming back to Zora Neale Hurston and Vance Randolph. One of the things that they received a lot of academic criticism for was the sense that they had, in essence, gone native. They had become part or were part of the communities that they were documenting. And
right, they weren't outside observers.
No,
being impartial is how they were viewed by their peers.
And Randolph was very clear that he understood the Ozarks people well enough to know that if he was an outside observer, they would give him no information.
Well, and that was very much Hurston's experience as well. She had that same problem, that if she, if that people were not forthright with her. And this is again the Wilkie material on page 82. That so many concluded that magic had no place any longer by the 20th century with African American communities. And Zora Neale Hurston, she gave an example that she was talking with a Mrs. Rachel Silas of Sanford, Florida. So I asked her where I could find a good hoodoo doctor. Do you believe in that old fogeyism, child? Oh, don't see how nobody can do none of that work, do you? She laughed unnecessarily, and it goes on. And then Zora says, don't fool yourself, I answered with assurance. People can do things to you. I've seen things happen. And she said, so sure enough, yeah, well. And then it says, by the end of her conversation with Mrs. Silas and another neighbor, Hurston established not only that both women believed in hoodoo, but actively sought magical protection from specialists and were able to direct Hurston where to find a two-headed doctor, which is practitioner. Her experience illustrates not only the prevalence of magical practice, but the secret nature, and this is exactly what anthropologists faced, in that if you weren't willing to immerse yourself in a community and be able to talk with people in those settings where they understood you and trusted you, you're not going to get the full story.
Or in some cases, any story.
That's right. And not just on this subject, but on a lot of things. And so
Yes.
I think sometimes we fool ourselves that we know everything there is to know that's been because it's been published, and that's not necessarily the case.
It's not. And referencing hoodoo, herb and root magic by Catherine Ironwood, as an example, badger teeth, or having a badger tooth. And the badger in question is a real badger, and having one of its teeth. And a badger tooth is recommended for good luck in the famous 19th century magical book, Powwows or the Long Lost Friend by John George Holman, which is drawn from German magical lore, but its use has spread throughout the world. A badger tooth is referencing as a sovereign gambler's charm. Holman claimed that those who wear or carry a badger tooth will win at gambling games such as lottery, cards, slots, bingo, and horse racing. It can be fitted out as a watch or keychain fob, or carried in a mojo bag with equally good results if it is anointed or fed with Van oil or Hoyt's cologne. Those who do this often recite the 23rd Psalm and concentrate on their desires as they rub the tooth. But zoological notes further that badgers, because badgers are a cold climate animal, so in the American South, the alligator tooth sometimes performs the same magical function. And it is very interesting, particularly in the upper South and the deep South, that there is conflation between, of course, hoodoo and voodoo, the material practices, the conjure practices of hoodoo being utilized by those who follow the voodoo religion. But there's also, and I think many people would potentially find this very confusing, a very strong crossover with, for example, right here, the use of the 23rd Psalm and a lot of other scripture, and the fact that many hoodoo conjurers felt a very strong affiliation with, first of all, with the Bible, and as well as a strong affiliation with traditional Christianity, traditional in the sense of traditional to those particular regions.
Very true, very true. I want to also mentioning the badger tooth, and I actually have seen where certain animal teeth will be set into the head of a cane for luck, and I've heard that was a gambling tradition. Another thing is that sort of just the opposite. Having that tooth was powerful in that sense. Losing teeth, a person losing teeth could also have a magical significance. And to be perfectly honest, this can take us all the way back to the tooth fairy, etc., of why we put teeth under pillows and are paid for them. But one tradition in the Caribbean that evolved through hoodoo and voodoo practices was if you lost a permanent tooth, that tooth was actually thrown over the roof of the house.
Yes.
And an interesting thing too, when I read this in the materials, it made me think of Amy Tan's book, The Joy Club, and the movie that came out of it, because there is a scene in the book and the movie where one of the, because it highlights several women who ended up coming to America from China in the earlier part of the 20th century and what happened to them and their families. And this particular one, she was a young teenager, and her mother had basically, after her first husband died, the girl's father had been raped and then forced into being a minor wife for this other man, and had a baby in that household, who a superior wife had taken away. And her mother dies, and as her mother is dying, she tells her to protect her baby brother and to get, basically for them to get out of there. And the girl and her mother had basically been a wise woman. And so to gain control and get her baby brother, she accused the wife that was holding the baby away of cursing her and showing that she had lost a jaw tooth. Now, in reality, she had lost it earlier, but the belief was that this woman had done something, she had basically caused a curse that had killed her mother and so forth. And as a result, she had lost this tooth. And losing the tooth was so significant that they allowed her to take her brother and leave. So, yeah. I mean, these same kinds of beliefs are worldwide. It's interesting.
And I think that is certainly contributes to interesting commonalities and interesting connections that we see that wouldn't necessarily make sense to contemporaries today.
Right.
And there's several different factors that appear to be going on or were going on in certainly colonial America, and then through the 19th century, that you saw amalgamated communities gathering essentially, quote unquote, outside the pale, beyond acceptable civilization. And of course, those communities today, or the archaeological locations of those communities, are not outside civilization today, because the United States moved westward and development came with them. But you're looking at individual, former slaves. You're looking at runaway indentured servants.
Mm-hmm.
You're looking at Native American groups,
mm-hmm.
All existing in this liminal space between the very uneasy edge between, quote unquote, colonial civilization and the frontier. And they had to exist there because they might get arrested, they might get put back into service if they were closer to cities. And they also had, in many cases, had to exist close enough that they could still manage things like trade, and as well as stay or attempt to steer clear of particular hunting grounds or particular Native American groups who would kill them for infringing within their space.
Yes. Yeah. It was a tenuous situation in many cases.
And, my personal conjecture, and based on some of the things that I've read, is that much of what we are still coming to understand as unique American conjure or American witchcraft were developed from these points, and these points of hybridization or cross-pollination of ideas. These were people groups who were most likely to be employing their traditions, witchcraft, because they were individuals who could not rely on money or prestige or traditional court systems in many cases. In some cases, simply because there was no court system in place yet. And at the same time, these are individuals who have a very strong, rich history of being connected with, if they're indentured servants from the British Isles. There's a very strong connection with the cunning folk. If they are African Americans, there's a very strong connection with West African animism. And I hesitate to use the word animism because I don't think that it does the belief structures justice. But
more of the West African cosmology. You used that term earlier, but I think that's more fitting.
And then of course the connection with particularly Creek and sometimes Cherokee, as well as other Native American groups, with their respective cosmologies being inserted as well. And a particular group that you see in Appalachia initially that I find really fascinating, which is German folk magic, sometimes referred to as powwow, which I think is a really interesting use of the term. And things like the traditional hex signs, and a
doctors,
lot, and there's just such a unique fusion and such a unique insertion of magic through those initially colonial era German settlers.
Yes, and there was sort of a creolization of these ideas where they retained their separateness, but then they borrowed and used tools or materials from other traditions that ultimately over time overlap and becomes its own mixture of magic.
It does. And the German powwow doctors did strongly influence modern day hoodoo, or the development of American hoodoo. And it's largely unseen. Now, coming back to the Ozarks, all of these people groups that we're talking about in the colonial era, you have them in the Ozarks.
Yes, you do. People don't always think about it, but they were all here. And some of the things that they practiced then, you see today being employed a lot in New Age practices and Wicca, so forth, as if it's newly found or a thing, of their creation, or something that is simply sprouting from the air almost. The proliferation of certain cleansing practices and use of salt, for instance, as if it's a brand new thing. I grew up, having small bowls of salt in your windowsills was just normal practice, but
Right. And so speaking of salt, I'm going to go back to Catherine Ironwood's book for a moment. There's a couple of things that I liked about what she wrote. Salt does what you tell it to, quote unquote, is common folk wisdom, And for that reason, we see salt used for many purposes. And so a list, of course, and to me, this is interesting. We see the degradation of the folk practice occur during 20th century, including in rural areas. So, for example, we recognize that spilling salt, quote unquote, is unlucky, but typically that's as far as it goes. In tradition, certainly in conjure tradition, salt is used for home protection, for good luck in a new home, to get rid of unwanted guests, to keep unwanted visitors from returning to your home, to bring your spouse safely home, to get a job, to kill a love jinxing situation, to reverse a jinx. I like this one. To run a man stark crazy, to hurt an enemy, to move someone out, and that the additional magical uses of salt can also include the use of, including but not limited to, agrimony, alder, ammonia, angelica, balm of Gilead buds, blackberry, black dog hair, black pepper, broom, button snake root, caraway, dogbane, Epsom salts, frankincense, graveyard dirt, lemongrass, nettle, rattlesnake master, red pepper, saltpeter, sulfur, tobacco, vandal root, and willow.
Well, and interesting, and is that a use of it would often be used around, say, a butter churn or things like that to keep it from being soured by witches or evil spirits. And it's funny because spilling salt, often is considered bad luck, but spraying salt around is used as protection. And that's a tradition I grew up in.
And that is also it speaks very powerfully into this situation where certain magical practices, certain aspects of witchcraft, are used in one way for one thing and used another way to achieve the opposite, which is very confusing to the uninitiated. It's
true, but it really does make sense in practice.
And to me, it is worth noting that we have certainly a long-standing tradition of just these superficial elements of magic and witchcraft that have a folk magic that have and folk conjure that have made their way in. Salt is an excellent example. Spilling salt's bad luck, so on and so forth. But not, the in-depth understanding of the use of salt in conjure is not known by the average person. And we see that largely across the board, and it has really created a very ready space for a certain small handful of practices to really get introduced into a public that is seeking a more contextualized cosmology and really become almost branded, almost brand named uses. And sage comes to mind because there's the idea that we have individuals running around offering to sage someone's house for a fee and rid them of their problems and their spirits and the residents who may also be living in the house, whether those residents want to go or not. And it is, I feel, a lack of nuance and a very superficial approach to what is in reality very rich, textured, and complex traditions.
Yes, and to be blended does not work the way some people promise that it does.
Well, and in many cases it can't.
Right.
That's not saying that certain things can't be done,
Mhm.
but it is saying that they need to be approached with hmm, with a lot of humility and a lot of respect for the past and our ancestors.
Yes. Yes. And a little more um, deeper understanding of the intricacies of consciousness and energies, um, and how it interrelates.
And it does. These are very there's a lot of, to put it mildly, there's a lot of moving parts.
Yes, literally. That is. Um, another thing, and other foodstuffs are come into this conversation a lot, whether it be tobacco, whether it be alcohol,
Sugar.
sugar, eggs, rice, typically foods that are white often are used. And then sort of almost, 180 from these kinds of tools going to metals,
Yes.
which I do find very interesting in a lot of regards.
And obviously a number of metals have strong occult symbolism.
Mhm,
There's two that almost everyone knows about, and the first one is iron, typically in the form of horseshoes, and
mhm.
the second one is silver, typically in
Yes,
the form of how to kill a werewolf.
yes, yes. Um, but of course, with werewolves, if you know their human name, you can just call it, of course, 3 times. Um, then you dispatch them or turn them back into their human form.
Which is very, very handy. Sometimes it's difficult when you have to wrestle their driver's license away from them.
Especially since the picture is not going to match. Yeah, hope they aren't a pit pocket on top of being a werewolf.
Oh,
But silver coins typically are viewed as good luck, keep the devil away. Tradition of giving a baby a silver dollar. Um, I that isn't that old of a custom here in the Ozarks. Using silver coins for rings or silver spoons actually is what you see a lot in Appalachia and the Ozarks. And a lot of people who either make or wear spoon rings may not know that origin is magical. The belief of bringing good luck and protection.
yes. Of course, the silver is predominantly associated with the moon.
Yes. And that it viewed as being healing, and there actually is science involved with that, is because that comes from over time them noticing that babies of more well-to-do families tended to survive and live at a higher rate than other babies, and the association came from the fact that they were fed from a silver spoon. And that's where the phrase, you weren't born with a silver spoon in your mouth, comes from. but there is some truth to that because silver does tend to be antimicrobial. So, a real silver spoon tends to kill microbes and bacteria at a higher rate than, say, a copper or iron one would. So, in essence, there was some magic going on.
And in regards to iron, iron is traditionally associated with the Roman god Mars.
Yes. Yes.
So, and it is important not to discount the impact that Roman beliefs had, particularly in Western civilization, obviously, but then also on British custom because of the longstanding connection, ultimately, and one that would continue to be interjected into British history with things like the Norman invasion, etc. So the use and iron is, to me, it's very interesting. Iron have, particularly in the form of nails, has a long tradition in hoodoo, but iron is also considered a ward against fairies.
Yes. But also a war against witches and evil spirits, and so very, and of course, with fairies, that comes from a tradition where fairies were not Disney nice.
No, it's very important to understand that fear of fairies was warranted considering their manifestation.
Yes.
Now, what about, and I'm going to grab my hoodoo book for a moment, but the use of iron nails in conjure is particularly interesting. What are your thoughts in that regard?
I mean, it's a long-standing practice, and it's similar. People will use nails. They will also use carved wood or thorns. And I think that came about in times when nails were hard to come by and they were hand forged and you didn't always have them really available. And you certainly didn't go down to the hardware store and buy a box of 500 and have them sitting in the kitchen drawer. I think that the idea is that you have these obstacles, these pointed, sharp things that whatever you are repelling has to navigate around. And it makes a lot of conceptual sense to me.
Right. And it's the concept that, and surprisingly, there's some really interesting crossover. The concept is that something that resembles another thing, something naturally occurring in nature that resembles something else, has the ability to connect and affect the thing. And so putting sharp things in a bottle and using it in a specific way could infer sharpness into the conjure.
Yes. Much like a puppet, sticking pins in a doll. Very similar. A witch's peg is very similar. Just as a fetish jar often would be hidden in a threshold or a pathway, somewhere where the person intended it to have an effect on would be passing. Witch pegs would be buried in the pathway to the front door. And the idea was that a witch would not be able to step on it. So basically it would act as a barrier.
Yes.
like a force field.
Right. And elements of those, people can laugh about that,
Hmm.
but various aspects of conjure leave a resonance in the energy in the space of many locations.
And I think that's very fair. We talk about energies a lot, and I think that when people are to say talking about the paranormal, they the idea of energy and uh, a shift in the atmosphere um, is accepted. Everyone has walked into a room where it was heavy,
Yeah,
noticeably heavy, without a meteorological or scientific basis for it. Um, but it's really the same thing.
it is. It is. And in many cases the same concept, but it's just very focused.
Yes,
And
very,
I know
very much so.
we were talking briefly about this before we started, but I wanted to include it on the episode. Again, coming back to our secret and sacred, contextualizing the artifacts of African American magic and religion by Laura A. Wilkie. Wilkie notes, again, the high frequency of nails, spikes, several tablespoons, metal knives, both real and quote unquote fake, church projectile points, two church scrapers, all of these things being found in unique ways that imply ritual magic or conjure magic.
Hmm.
This assemblage dates between 1848, when the plantation was founded, 1891, so on and so forth. And something that was referenced, that I found really, really interesting, referenced in the article, was the Hermitage.
Yes.
And for individuals who do not know, the Hermitage is Andrew Jackson, President Jackson's home and plantation outside of Nashville, Tennessee. Beautiful location. And had the opportunity to go there a year and a half ago. And
Hmm.
a busy day, beautiful spring afternoon. And there is a slave cabin with a threshold point that has an extraordinary amount of energy associated with it.
Yes, I know you've told me this story, and I, it's fascinating. Why don't you tell people what happened?
It, in the sense of, and this is, to me, this is the fun part of research. And you simply document your intuitional points, oftentimes not knowing if it's ever going to come to anything.
Right.
And I spent the day at the Hermitage, March of last year, of 22, and very, very busy day just in terms of the public. The place was crowded. That's the short version. It was inadvertently, on my case, Andrew Jackson's birthday, and so there was a brief ceremony in the garden next to the mansion, where Jackson and his wife were both buried, and it was very beautiful. There were 3 points of that intuitionally resonated. The first was a very strong sense that there was a woman on the front porch staring at the docent. And but interestingly, going into the house, the tours tend to move. There's so many people that have to be moved through the home that you really don't get much of a time to soak up the space.
Right.
And you get to be there, but you really don't get to soak up the space itself. And quite frankly, with a nod to the two upcoming tours that we have at the Kendrick House, the Kendrick House is only a few years younger than the Hermitage. It
Hmm.
is it is built on much of the same conceptual floor plan, and not as grand as the Hermitage, but very, very similar in terms of its structure and being able to, having the honor of being able to be part of Dark Ozarks and work with Paranormal Science Lab. I'm so accustomed to simply being able to not just visit the Kendrick house, but to hang out and sit on the furniture. And it's all original. And it was such an odd, and for me personally, off-putting, but odd feeling to be managed so carefully. And I understand why. I'm not taking an issue with the Hermitage. They have to do things the way they do. I was just not used to it. And I love the fact, I love being able to walk into the Kendrick house and simply experience the space for as long as I want to, largely, without being moved. We don't have large spaces cordoned off. You're not looking through glass. You're none of those things. You get to experience the space as it is, as it was, and as it still. And I think that's very powerful. But because of the speed of going through, et cetera, it was very difficult for me to get a read on the mansion itself.
Right.
Then wandering down below the mansion through a massive field is the original quote unquote plantation home that was there before Andrew Jackson built the Hermitage. And then also next to it is an original slave cabin. And to me, this is really powerful personally, in part because it's helping me improve my trust in my own intuition in this process. And so on page 89 of the aforementioned article, it references that Samford, in his 1996 article, reported the recovery of conjure bottles from the walls of slave cabin sites in North Carolina and Virginia, and has suggested that intact bottles recovered from beneath the floors of slave cabins at the Hermitage Plantation, Tennessee, may also have been Minkisi containers. It is likely that other conjure bottles have been excavated archaeologically, but not recognized. And so the cabin in question that's included, that's being referenced in this article, I walked into, and I know that because there's not very many still standing slave cabins in the at the Hermitage, and the primary slave cabin that impacted me so dramatically has plexiglass on the floors where you can see where they have done excavations beneath the cabin. Again, not dissimilar to my experience at Crescent Hotel, in the sense that beautiful day, nothing spooky, nothing strange. There's lots and lots of other people around. There were a number of families inside the cabin at the time. There were plenty of people outside the cabin. People were running back and forth all over the place. And I go to step on the threshold, which is, the threshold has a great magic significance, particularly in terms of protection. I step on the threshold and I just stop, because there is something about that space that is resonating unbelievably powerfully. It stops me. I physically can't see anything, but there is an energy there that is just, it absolutely grabbed my attention and said, hey, pay attention. There is stuff here. And had nothing to go on literally until I was doing research and reading this article last week. So that was unbelievably appreciated. And again, really speaks to the fact of how important it is to do research. And then the other is simply the fact, in terms of simply the recollection, the winding path from that slave cabin on down into the open fields in the valley, where the majority of slave cabins were. The majority of the enslaved population was down there, as well as some barns and the cotton gin, etc. Everything down there. There's a beautiful winding path The cottonwoods and the black walnuts wind around the space. And it just, in a very, this is weird because in such a very inviting way, but also a very subtly unsettling way, just calls you to keep going, or certainly did me. And in it feels very liminal. It feels very on the edge of stepping through within that space.
Yes, and I've experienced that as well. In particular at the Anderson House in Lexington, Missouri, as well as stepping through liminal space. But it's a feeling that's in some ways hard to describe, but it has such a pull at time, when it happens, that I can see where people could be lulled by it. To me, it was just jarring, and it's like, oh no, pay attention. And that's, very interesting, but I do find it very interesting that they found conjure bottles there, and it makes perfect sense. I wanted to mention in conjunction with this that in Hoodoo tradition, conjures are believed analogous to shaman, that conjurers can see spirits, can see ghosts. And also, and this is a little bit different than my experience and as a investigator and researcher, but that there's a belief that conjure can be used not only against other people or for protection, but against spirit as well. Not necessarily, and I think this is sort of the misnomer people get, not necessarily that you, quote, make them go away, but it is, again, protection against the spirit or ghost. And part of that comes from the traditional belief of in these communities that a ghost, much like a corpse, could bring pestilence or even death by its visitation, which we typically don't see that belief today, other than sometimes you do get people asking, can they hurt you? And I think some people do have fear, could they somehow kill you? But not necessarily to bring a disease or illness.
And that aspect, and you could conjecture that has largely died out today because of the fact that infectious disease is largely controlled.
Well, that plus practice of embalming and or cremation eliminates a lot of those potential problems where coming across a corpse, pre-embalming or digging up a grave could infect one with whatever that person died from, and which, of course, is probably the impetus for Zombie Lord originally. And in fact, they talk about when they find medieval mass graves, they have to be careful because there is a risk that there could be smallpox or bubonic plague that could be infectious. Also, in Siberia with the tundra, defrosting, they're finding the same things with burials, that they have to be careful that whatever killed someone or even animals hundreds of years or thousands of years ago could be active. So again, there's some science to this, but in hoodoo, there fetishes would be used to basically keep a pesky spirit at bay.
Right. And that's still not a bad idea, I suppose.
And another thing that comes out of these magical practices that you see happen today, to this day, and with people who would have no idea that it comes from magical practices, probably, and might be a look askance if you told them so, is that some of the practices with dealing with the recently deceased and their grave. How many people put personal items on a tombstone? That kind of thing. And in African American tradition, you did so for certain reasons. For instance, the deceased cup and saucer that they used during their final days of illness, you would put on the grave. And that was to keep basically everyone else from becoming ill. If they had medicine bottles, those would be put on the grave and turned upside down so that the medicine would seep into the grave. The Wilkie article notes the Rose and Santaford article from 1985 documenting archaeological excavations in Arkansas, actually, of personal items decorating graves, including seashells, broken glassware, soap dishes, tureens, coffee cups, syrup jugs, ornamental vases, cigar boxes, gun lots, tomato cans, even teapots, flower pots, plaster images, and carved stonework of decorating the grave, items that would be of particular interest to that person. And we still, and people still do it today.
They do.
Not, thinking it's just sentimental.
Yes. I this shouldn't have surprised me. This is just a sideways story, but I was actually assisting Dale, who's of course my pastor, as well as publisher, as he was preaching a revival over in Shannon County a number of years ago, and we were put up in the small quote unquote parsonage building next to this church, and rural Southern Baptist church in 2009. No cell service. We're far enough out into the central Missouri Ozarks that there just was no cell service to be had, and two, almost no artificial light pollution dropped drastically. So it's unbelievably beautiful to look at the stars. But it was interesting. The sort of the housing building did not have a kitchen. It had several bedrooms and a large shared bathroom, but no kitchen. So if you wanted a snack, you had the keys and you go to the church pantry, the church kitchen that's behind, built onto the church itself. So you traipse across, and then behind the church is an expansive and comparatively old cemetery. And so I need a bologna sandwich, and it's 10 o'clock at night. So I take the keys and walk across the yard, and it's very, very dark, and go inside into the kitchen. So now I'm by myself in the dark in the church kitchen, and wandering around looking for the refrigerator. And I look out and I see what looks like ghost lights. And I'm like, what? And Come to find out, a number of these graves are appropriately decorated with solar powered, like little plastic hummingbirds and things. And I'm just going, thanks. Totally faking me out. Totally faking me out in November of '09.
Well, I mean, it's just sort of a modern equivalent, but not thought of necessarily in the same terms. But I think the innate psychological urge is the same, whether we want to admit it or not.
Yes, yes, and perhaps the certain ritualistic elements that we would call are calling on a very, archetypal level, that perhaps it does mean something.
Well, I do think that when traditions continue, even when the original sort of reason behind it is kind of lost to the mist, it happens because it does serve some sort of purpose.
And that is fair. And there is an implication that on perhaps not an unspoken level, that these elemental traditions do speak to us from generation to generation, and call, and some answer that call and others do not.
Exactly. I want to touch on, and you mentioned powwow just briefly, but
Yes.
I want to talk about that just a little bit. And I think that one thing that people tend to recognize from powwow that they may not know that's an association are hex signs.
Correct. Now, what are your thoughts in terms of hex signs being utilized in the Ozarks?
I mean, it does come from the Pennsylvania Dutch tradition of powwow. You do see occasionally, and I was trying to think earlier. I was somewhere in the last few weeks. We've been so busy with things, I've lost track of everything. But I was driving somewhere and passed a barn, and it was like, oh, it's Pennsylvania Dutch barn sign, which they're beautiful. It is a form of hex signs. You don't see a lot of them in the Ozarks, but you do occasionally. And I can't remember where I was at that I saw it. And in fact, it had been recently repainted, and there were two on the side of the barn I saw, and likely on the other side as well. I do believe in the Ozarks that it does come, certainly comes from that tradition. There are similar, obviously, hex signs and work in Eastern Europe and in the Balkans and so forth, particularly. And I'm sure that there's a core, influence. Not sure which came first or who influenced who there in Germany, but they tend to be signs of protection, and they can be marked on all kinds of items, very small personal ones, barns, etc. I don't know if I've told this story on an episode before, but I was at a flea market or antique store, probably 2 or 3 years ago, and I was trying to remember where at, and I'm not sure. Actually, might have been in Springfield, and just looking and picked up. It was a hobo art, like a candle. It looked like a candlestick, and turn it over. And so it very much was almost trench art style, but I turned it over, and on the bottom was a hex mark. And it was like, oh, okay, you know. And a lot of people might not have recognized it, probably wouldn't have recognized it. And I'm not even sure if the original carver is the one who put the mark on it or not, because it was such a distinct, it really looked like trench art carving, except for the head smart. And it appeared that my guess was it was added later.
Right. And that's and in that particular case, how do you conjecture that the hex mark would have been used? Would it have been as a protective piece just within the home?
My guess. And often to keep malevolent spirits or witches away is usually, traditionally what they were used for. And so my guess, it was item of protection in a home, wherever this piece was setting, probably on a mantle or something.
Mm-hmm.
So it was about a foot tall candlestick. Wooden.
Wow. Now, Vance Randolph and this isn't on our list, but I want to jump into it briefly. Ozark Magic and Folklore has a chapter on power doctors.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, this is really fascinating. Power doctors, in short, are essentially male witches who are intrinsically opposed to witchcraft. So they're using witchcraft to stop witches.
Yeah, it gets a little almost confusing. It's a little bit of an oxymoron.
And
in some ways.
It's and also used at times contracted to help with illness, disease, of various problems. It to me is a really fascinating review of in essentially white Ozark culture and very post-settlement rural American culture of an understanding of conjure, an understanding of magic, an understanding of these things being translated through very gender specific lenses, power doctors being men. And their approach tends to be vastly different than, say, for example, granny women, midwives, or the quote unquote witches who were being identified as women. Not all witches are women, but in this particular case, the aspect and of course other aspects of confusion, the idea that granny women, quote unquote, could be practicing magic and not in most cases not run the risk of witchcraft, of an accusation of witchcraft. They would be seen as being very benevolent to the community. The idea this is not dissimilar in some ways from the traditional Cherokee approach to witchcraft, in the sense that you have healers, medicine men, shaman leaders, that sort of thing, although the word shaman is not used in Cherokee tradition. But many individuals within the community who are technically using magic, but the idea that they are using magic for the good of the community means that they are not at risk of being considered inhuman or charged with witchcraft. It is only those who step outside of the community and are considered to be using those powers against individuals within the community. Do they, quote unquote, become witches?
Right. It's a very subjective dichotomy.
It is, but it also inadvertently, it speaks very powerfully to the use of magic without saying so, in the idea that
Right.
magic is simply a tool set, and it is not good or bad. It just is. And then it becomes the question of how is it being wielded by the practitioner and for what reason?
Exactly. And that has always made sense to me. That aspect of it is that a tool set, a hammer is not inherently good or bad, but it can be used to build a house or to kill someone.
Yes. And I think that that analogy, the analogy of tools, is a really ideal way to approach practical conjure, practical magic.
Agreed. Another thing with conjuring, whereas the power doctors were men, in the hoodoo tradition, conjurers there were not. There really wasn't a gender expectation there. Men and women both were conjurers as much as the other. Only in the sense in the hoodoo tradition, midwives, of course, tended to be women, older women, but otherwise there really wasn't, your witch wasn't necessarily a woman or a man, or a conjurer wasn't necessarily a man or a woman. It was just who had the skill set.
And jumping over for a moment to Cherokee Black magic lore, a witch could be anyone at any time.
Exactly.
Because the concept of a Black magic witch in Cherokee tradition is really, this is one area that is so vastly removed from belief structures that are associated with the church.
Yeah.
That it is, to me, fascinating, because witches were considered inhuman and more on the line of a shape-shifting manifested being that takes on the guise of a human.
Yes. That's a good way of summing that up. You had said before that you wanted to touch on booger dogs.
Yeah, I I do love booger dogs. I've yet to see one, and that makes me sad. But that since they're a death omen, that also makes me happy. And certainly the concept, and this is, you don't have to dig fairly deep, but you definitely have to dig underneath all of the crap about the Ozark Howler to get to booger dogs and witch cats.
Yeah, I mean, on an empirical level with the howler, I think it really goes back to big cats in the early settlement days. But I think that particularly in the depiction of it, it gets incorporated with the Scotch-Irish traditions of booger dogs, particularly in Scotland and England. Yeah. They are a phantom hound, usually very large, sometimes headless, if that wouldn't be even more unsettling. And I still want to know how a headless phantom dog howls, but anyway.
Well, Well, and to that, just speaking to that, and with the variety of supernatural or paranormal manifestations, we see very strange manifestations of things that don't apparently make sense. Like,
Oh yeah, and
I,
I'm just joking there, but yeah.
no, I know it, but I think it's an interesting, um, just subject to dive into for a second, because even just the concept of disembodied voices, how how does a spirit that has no voice box physically make noise, and yet it happens?
It does happen. Certainly we've experienced it a number of times. Um,
Yes.
well, and another example are shadow men that appear much taller than a person, that 9 feet tall. Seeing those kind of shadow men is not that uncommon uh, in the commonality of how many times shadow men are seen. But so and no, I don't think that they were ghosts of giants. So um, these phantoms or specters tend to come across in ways that they appear to manifest them, by will. So, um, or some mechanism that we don't understand. So, um, our sense of physical reality and what we experience with them are definitely two different things. But yes, they
And
do often tend to be a death omen in the old world as well as here. Um, and a number of those kind of sightings in the Ozarks, I mean, from years past, and we still get accounts occasionally. We got one last year out of the Rolla area, um, and had one appear actually shortly before my father passed away,
yeah,
which actually appeared as my dad's favorite dog, who had been dead for years, to the point of family members just saying, recognize the dog. So um, how they manifest, I really don't know. But again, I think my favorite comes out of Douglas County, Booger County, which
hmm,
people like to joke about that, but that comes from the word booger, meaning phantom or spirit, and comes from the old Scottish word boggart for ghost. So the nickname for the county, it has to do with phantoms.
it does.
Um,
It does.
and
And the fact that a lot of people who wandered into Douglas County never wandered out if they weren't wanted.
exactly. But that is the supposition. And the tale that comes out of the Civil War from there regarding a booger dog is that a group of soldiers, they knew they were going to have a skirmish the next morning, and traditionally seeing a phantom hound was a death omen. And during the Civil War, it became an omen that if you saw a phantom hound, that you would die the next day in battle.
Yes.
So the soldier sees the phantom hound, of course, is terrified. They have the battle and he survives. And he's joyous and a bit bragging that he's beaten the curse, that he survived. And that evening, they're sitting around the campfire after supper, and he's cleaning his gun, and the gun goes off, misfires, and kills him.
Yes. And it really, that to me, that story is very powerful because it speaks to the
Fate.
inexorability of magic, the inevitability of magic.
Yes. And magic is fate, so to speak.
Yes. And just for categorical delineation, your booger dogs are mostly spectral hounds.
Yes.
They are, and they are typically recognized as death omens. Certainly from a Scots Irish perspective, there's two ways of putting it, and of course, one implication depends on the type of life that the person has led, could lead to the type of omen that manifests, in the sense that
Sure.
the spectral hound might be a very frightening visage of death, or the spectral hound might be a welcome friend.
Very true.
And that, I think, is very powerful and very telling. Now, the other side, for you have booger dogs, then you have witch cats. And
Yeah.
interestingly enough, witch cats are a completely different category. They are typically considered to be witches who shapeshift themselves into large cats.
Yes.
That
Which has an analogy to Native American lore, particularly Cherokee magic.
It does. There's a fascinating. Of course, we've all grown up with pop culture lore about witches turning themselves into cats or other things, and watching Harry Potter and so on and
Mhm.
so forth, and you just accept that this is part of a fun lore that you talk about at Halloween. And yet, when you begin to dig into serious Native American lore, it's not silly.
No, no. We view that differently, but there are a lot of corollaries, and the European corollaries were serious as they were developed. So
Yes. And what are your thoughts on this? Because we have very old European lore that's not dissimilar in terms of shape-shifting occult members.
mhm,
And then that becomes relegated to fairy tale and myth,
mhm.
and put on a shelf somewhere where those things don't happen. But and then those descendants of those people who put those stories on the shelves come over to North America and attempt to do the same thing with Native American lore that says
Mhm.
some things that are strikingly similar, particularly in terms of what we are recognizing today under the broad umbrella of Skinwalker. And yet, increasingly, there is documentation that suggests that this isn't just a bit of antique folklore.
Uh, true, true, and again, I think there is more to it than that, and that goes well beyond the amount of time that we have
Yes.
left to delve into tonight. But I think it is there is some aspect to it that is analogous to what we started talking about with, say, Hurston and Randolph in the 1930s, of people not be of being wary of discussing these things, but also the sort of the antecedent of that is that one reason that marginalized people in North America, whether they were African Americans, whether they were Native Americans, or certain ostracized people in the European community, would use witchcraft and magic as a means of tipping the scale in their favor.
Yes.
And with those that were more in control of society and the means of money and production, etc., then being wary of them and things being a bit of a seesaw balance. I think there's a corollary there that we put away childish beliefs in the old world. But when we come here, part of the view was, oh, everything that we encounter here from these other groups, it's not as enlightened, it's not as advanced. But on the other hand, you see things that seem to work. As we've said, a lot of this practical magic, it continues because it does seem to have some sort of effect of benefit, or people wouldn't waste their time doing it. And
Right.
so I think you observe that, and then it comes from a different tradition that you don't really understand. So it's harder to just say we're putting it on a shelf because we don't have all of the shorthand to understand it. So when we don't understand something, we tend to use that from a position of fear.
I think that's very fair. I do. And I'm generally pleased with the direction. The interest in the paranormal, etc., has allowed for a lot more open discussion
I think so.
about the thing. And I think that's overall very positive.
I do. I mean, there's good and bad to all to the uptick in popularity in the paranormal, but that is something that over time I think is beneficial. I'd like to switch over to discussing sort of the beginnings and background of some of the Ozark witchcraft beliefs that's covered in the Paul Brewster article. It's titled "An Ozark Superstition and Its World Affinities,"
Yes.
from 1950. And yeah, of course, he mentions again that all of these different groups have some similar practices that come to bear. And of course, he does start off with an account actually from Randolph, and particularly talking about imitative or magic. And in particular, we're talking about images, dolls, etc., what some people would call voodoo dolls, and that was a practice in the Ozarks, and this would be a practice that was not per se voodoo.
Correct.
And I think that's something that would be surprising to a lot of people today. But all European traditions used these ideas as well. Sometimes it was referred to as a witch's doll, and it really goes back. We know there were similar practices as far back as Assyria and ancient Egypt, but in the Isles, certainly it goes back hundreds of years, and I'm sure much further. And it could be a more traditional doll, but often they were made of clay, which I find interesting. And there's a bit of a parallel, makes you think of a golem in Jewish tradition, made of dirt. But what is interesting is that the use of imitative magic and dolls even led to murder trials in
Yeah.
England in the Middle Ages. So I mean, these were very serious concerns.
They were. I want to share the Vance Randolph quote. It's one of my favorite quotes from the book, and Brewster begins his article in Ozark Superstition and its World Affinities with the quote. To me, it's incredibly evocative. He said, "I once knew a man who spent half an hour every evening playing with a wooden doll, which was dressed to resemble a local woman who could do things. Time after time, he would thrust the little image into the fireplace until the feet touched the glowing embers and then snatch it out again. The expression on his face was most unpleasant. I am quite indifferent to the ordinary superstitions of the hill folk. I visit graveyards at night, shoot cats on occasion, and burn sassafras wood without a tremor. And yet, something akin to horror gripped me as I watched the witch master's sadistic foolery. I should not care to have that man burning a poppet wrapped in my undershirt."
Neither would I.
No. And this is another aspect that I think is important to take into consideration. The fact that individuals who place themselves within the community to combat witches, oftentimes, certainly in this particular case, and we seem to see in many cases throughout Europe, were gripped by a certain amount of sadism.
Yes, I mean, certainly. I mean, the Inquisition certainly comes to mind.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
Um,
It,
well, when you infuse someone with a sense of superior morality, it can have an intoxicating effect that sometimes does not have a beneficial outcome.
no, no. And of course, human beings across the board, the potential for certain amounts of this response are not gender specific, but history does record a certain amount of this specific behavior in men.
Yes, and often, as in this particular case, towards marginalized women.
Yes, which is disturbing to say the least.
It is. It is. And unfortunately, tendencies that have not completely been eradicated.
No, and I mean, based on the problematic realities of humanity, probably
Yeah.
won't be.
No,
That
not anytime
and that,
soon.
that being able to look there's for me the summation of the conversations of witchcraft really speak powerfully into important and difficult aspects of the human condition, and in understandings or lack of understandings in terms of morality, in terms of power, in terms of authority, in terms of respect for the ancestors. There are so many lessons to be learned by studying society through the lens of witchcraft, that even before you get to the questions of what works, what doesn't work, it's incredibly powerful and insightful.
It really is. And one thing I do want to mention in this, especially with the Halloween season coming up, is that this use of puppets or dolls over time, even in Europe, substitutes would be made at times, including vegetables such as onions, beets, or turnips. And
Yes.
of course, turnips were the original jack-o'-lantern.
Yes, they were.
Yes, they were. And so I find that interesting, and certainly you have to wonder if there's some ancestral association with that, with our connotations of the jack-o'-lantern. But another thing is that other things that could be substituted would be, particularly in voodoo and hoodoo, would be the use of candles instead of a poppet, in which they would be pierced with pins and then burn the candle. And when the
Yes.
pins drop, that is when the magic happens. It's ironic because I've noticed online the last couple of years, I've seen articles and I've seen memes with pictures of candles with the nails or pins, and being advertised as an early form of an alarm clock, that you burn the candle, and when the nail or drops and hits the candle holder, it would wake you up. And it's like, well, it might wake you up, but that's not what it was intended for.
No.
And so now basically this whole almost fabricated lore is coming out that, oh, that's an alarm clock, which, no, that's not what that was about at all. So it is interesting. One other thing I wanted to touch on, which this is something that ties to witchcraft in America, and our sort of our big focus in America of the pinnacle, sort of that big moment, with, of course, is the Salem witch trials. And one thing that isn't mentioned a lot is that actually two of the people who ended up being executed for witchcraft were initially charged because of their use of dolls. Actually, the very first victim, Bridget Bishop, among the charges brought was that of piercing and destroying poppets in order to inflict pain and death upon her enemies. And then George Burroughs, who was also executed, was accused and found guilty of having made poppets and having forced others in his group to stick them with pins. And in Burroughs' case, it's interesting because he was actually an ordained minister and a graduate of Harvard. And of course, Increase and Cotton Mather, who were prosecutors, were also alumni. So basically, they were all alumni, and he was a minister, and he was being accused of witchcraft on this basis. I do find that interesting, and a point that you don't hear about a lot with the witch trials.
So really
certainly not just an issue of voodoo.
No, not at all. And I think that's important. I think that's very powerful, very important for people to understand. And I'm very comfortable in going out, in a very public space like this, and expressing how much I respect voodoo as, first of all, as a religion, mm-hmm. and second of all, as an extraordinary testament to the resilience of humanity in the face of authority.
I agree, and as we've alluded to, some of this practical magic, I think that there is something to it, as they say, because people continue to practice it, particularly in our modern time, when it would be easy to relegate as antiquated or ineffective, and a lot of effort can be put into it, and usually that's not done without some benefit.
Correct. Absolutely correct. And perhaps that's a positive place to close.
I agree. So we invite you not to forget to check out upcoming events and merchandise at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com. Thank you again to Always Buying Books and Beard Engine Brewing Company for helping to bring the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
On the next episode, we are going to be discussing Halloween lore of the Ozarks. Catch the Dark Ozarks podcast on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or about any other podcast platform. Thank you, everyone. And remember, there are no easy answers in the Dark Ozarks.